I guess for the death penalty, we oppose the death penalty. As you see, I'm very appropriately dressed. I've got a lot of these T-shirts of various sorts that are against the death penalty. Excuse me just a moment. And you said the name of our organization correctly, Missourians to Abolish. Very recently, we were Missourians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. You may have seen that name used from time to time. But we changed it recently to Missourians to Abolish the Death Penalty, which is much more straightforward. That's what we're after. What comes next, what the alternatives are, take thought, but we want to abolish it first. First, let me give you a little background. We were formed, by the way, many, many years ago. In 1972, it was the culmination of a number of years of decreasing support for the death penalty, fewer death sentences, I don't think any executions for a while. And there was the case that came before the Supreme Court, Furman versus Georgia. And the Supreme Court knocked out that death sentence. They didn't totally abolish the death penalty. What they did was abolish that sentence because that case, the execution, planned execution, because of arbitrary and capricious wording in it. Too much scope for, well, arbitrary and capricious elements of the decision. So since it hadn't been completely knocked out, all the state legislatures went scurrying back to try to redo it and to try to take out what they saw as arbitrariness, capriciousness. And just a few years later, in 1976, a case also in Georgia, Gregg versus Georgia, came back with a guy who was challenging his death sentence. That time, Georgia had been working on changing the wording. That time, the Supreme Court accepted it and the guy was executed. So we had a brief element when there was no executions, but now they were back. Our first execution in Missouri after that was in 1989. And they've been going on since then. Since then, there have been, I think the latest figure I saw was 97 executions. And we're down to, I think it's 15 or 16 people on death row now. There are a couple of dates already set for later this year. One in April, one in June. And there's another guy who they say it's imminent. They just, the state Supreme Court is the one who actually sets the date. When somebody has existed all appeals, then the Attorney General puts the request on the desk, I'm sorry, I'm not getting this distance wrong, puts the request on the desks of the Supreme Court, and they're the ones who set the date. And there are a couple coming up who have exhausted all their appeals, and they're expecting this third one very soon. Last year, we executed 4 people. We're one of the high executing states. It's has nothing to do with crime. There are some studies that show that states with the death penalty, not only does it not decrease the amount of crime, in some states it has increased it. So much for public safety. In order to get a death sentence, according to Supreme Court case laws and legislative laws, you can only get the death, the prosecutor can only ask for a death sentence if it's a first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. Now, what's an aggravating circumstance? They're all laid out in the statutes. Prominently, if the victim was a law enforcement official or the death of a child. And there are several others that if they can persuade the grand jury that these aggravating circumstances were relevant in this case, then the prosecutor can ask for death. And the prosecutors are very important in this, by the way. They get to frame a lot of it to start with. And it's true there's another side, there's a defense side. There's the judge who can rule on various things. But the prosecutor frames the terms to start with. In statute also, there is a requirement that if someone does decide on guilt for someone for whom the prosecutor has asked for the death penalty, they must consider two options. One is death, obviously, and one is life without any possibility of parole ever. And I once read a study of jurors in past cases and their thinking and attitudes. And I remember one woman said she had voted for the death penalty for whoever the guy was because she thought that life was too cruel. It did. Well, the guy lost. The guy lost in that particular case, I remember. No women have been executed in Missouri since then. There have been several women on death row, but for some reason or other, they were not executed. There were 5. I looked up the number. 2 of them stand out in memory. One of them, tragic case. It was a case, the father was from the Middle East, was a Muslim from the Middle East, and he had come here with his wife who was Brazilian, and she, in the statistics, she was counted as Latina. And they had 3 daughters when they came. The older 2 daughters were old enough, they had been part of the family culture, and they were, the parents were very proud of them. The youngest was young enough so that as she went to school with other Americans, she became Americanized. She didn't want to work in the family business. She wanted to wear American clothes. She wanted to do American things. Her parents killed her for having brought dishonor on the family. The parents both were on death row, but the father died in prison, a natural death. I think it was diabetes. The mother she was off death row. It was commuted to a life sentence because he was obviously the instigator. The other case that I remember, this is one of the 5 women who had been on death row, was this other case was a couple, Faye and Ray Copeland. I don't know if you've heard of them. They ran a farm and were very illegal, did a lot of illegal things. And they would hire hobos, it was called in the literature, migrants, immigrants who were looking for work, or people wandering around, they called them hobos. And then these guys would disappear. Families who didn't, the fact that they were in such bad circumstances meant they didn't have the family support that meant people really pushed to find out where they were. Finally, they found bodies buried on this couple's farmland. And it became obvious they were hiring these guys to do this illegal work, and then they killed them so they couldn't talk. They went on death row. And he died on death row. And she was released on what they call a medical, can't read my own handwriting. It was a medical reason. She was sick, I've forgotten from what. So they let her out so her family could take care of her. Sometimes this is a cheap and easy way of letting the family have the expense of the final years of somebody who's very sick. I'm glad she was out, though. So none of these women were executed, which was a good thing to us. But the men who were executed have, well, the ones that these 97 who have gone, and then the 2 who are coming up, and the 2 who will probably follow sometime soon, have not. Last year, we had 4 executions. One, well, Amber McLaughlin. She was not included in the list of women who have been executed. She was transgender. So she was arrested and charged and convicted under her male condition before her transition. So it's not inaccurate to say that no women have been executed, although she counted herself a woman by this time, so she should have been included, actually. That was in January. In February, Leonard Raheem Taylor was executed. This was a really upsetting, well, they're all upsetting, but he was innocent. We were convinced he was innocent. In order to be convicted, there has to be evidence that I've forgotten the wording, but you have to have a whole lot of evidence. If you don't have that much evidence, then they may not get the death penalty. They may end up being guilty, maybe, but not having enough evidence to convict them is not the same thing as proving innocence, but it's enough to not get them the death sentence. And yet he got the death sentence. And that was very upsetting. They're all upsetting, but having an innocent person go. Another one was in June, Michael Tices. He was an artist and had a number of his artworks were displayed in various places in the context of his death row sentence. The last one last year, Johnny Johnson, in August. You may have seen a documentary. It's called Something Between the Cracks. I can't remember the name of the documentary. He was seriously mentally ill. Schizophrenia was one of the illnesses that I saw. He killed a little girl. And, well, you know what that's like for family, what it must be like. But the argument, his defense tried to argue that he was not capable of being executed. The person is supposed to know what they're being executed for it to be legitimate to be executed. He apparently did not even get that far to know what he was being executed for. That a lot of people when I say a lot of people have been upset by that, it's a little silly to say that because we're upset by all of them. But some of them have situations that are that stand out. In his case, mental illness. And when I say mental illness is a factor with many people on death row, I do not mean that mental illness means violence. I mean that all too often, someone who has been convicted of, who has committed gruesome murders, sometimes this person has been found to have a mental illness. Again, it doesn't mean that if you're schizophrenic, you're going to kill someone. Not at all. A lot of people have mental illnesses of one sort or another and are perfectly fine, functioning people. So, but still, that is a contributor to what has caused some of these murders in the first place. One of the reasons for our earlier name, Missourians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, is that there are alternatives that could start with, for example, adequate mental health care. My daughter works as a social worker with children who have been in horrible situations. She doesn't talk about her people, obviously, confidentiality, but they've been in horrible situations of one sort or another. If everybody got that kind of help, we might have fewer people. In fact, I once heard a mitigation specialist, someone who is hired to find out anything in the person that might cause some reason for a jury to decide on life instead of death. And she said everyone that she has worked with has some serious issue in their lives that could suggest problems. And whether it's substance abuse, addiction, whether it is brain damage, mental illness, horrible childhoods, and you say that shouldn't matter, but when your role models are bad, sometimes it's predictable. And then she paused a moment and she said, and the rest are innocent. Of course, the people who get the death penalty tend to be the people whose families have no resources. They are people who didn't have the support that everyone in this room has had and have given your families. So the guys who end up killing, there's reasons that go beyond what any of us could even imagine. We have a lobby day on March the 12th. If anyone would like to go to Jefferson City with us and talk to legislators about our legislation, which I'll mention in a minute, you would be welcome to go. And in fact, I have some stuff here that gives you information for getting in touch with the organization in case you want to arrange to be on it. The website is MADPMO, Missourians to abolish the death penalty. MO, Missouri, MADPMO. That will give you things coming up. These brochures are all I had. They're out of date. They give the old name, Missourians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. But basic information about the death penalty is in here. And if anybody here likes bumper stickers, as I do, I've got a few if you want to put it on your car. Legislation. Missouri, as you know, is not a state that, well, how should I put it, not as concerned with people's lives as everyone in this room is. The legislation we're working on this year, we've been working on it every year. And every year there is someone will introduce a bill for abolition of the death penalty. Well, we know it's not going anywhere. But there's a very interesting use for it. I saw an amicus brief filed in support of one person whose case was going to the Supreme Court. And they mentioned that Missouri is considering abolition. Well, considering meant that someone had filed this bill, and it was put on the back shelf, gathering dust, but still it had been filed. So it helped the lawyers in their brief. We've been going, though, for actively working on legislation, we've been going on the chipping away theory. The more things that can be chipped away as eligibility for the death penalty, the fewer people will actually be executed. This year, what we're working on is a loophole. Missouri is one of, I think, a couple of states that if a sentencing jury is not unanimous, then the judge can give the sentence. And there have been twice that I know of in recent years where the jury was split. In one case, it was 9-1 for life, and the 1 for death, the judge gave death. The judge is allowed to override. And that's the bill we're working on this year. It's not going to, I shouldn't say it's not going to go anywhere, but our lobbyist is not hopeful. There is an interesting development. People tend to think of abolishing the death, can't cope with all these slippery pages. They're sliding all over the place. People tend to think of abolishing the death penalty as a liberal thing, a left-wing thing. But there's a group called Concerned Conservatives who are working, talking among themselves, standing up, giving positions, testifying in support of abolition for various reasons. And they are becoming more outspoken. They haven't succeeded in swaying their conservative colleagues yet, but they have said they're talking behind the scenes. There's more and more publicity. I saw a newspaper article about them. They're not being quiet. And so I'm hoping that this means across the political spectrum, we can get opposition to the death penalty. It has opposition has aspects that various parts of the across the spectrum could support, the abolition could support. Whether it's the arbitrariness of government action, government overreach, whether it's the cruelty. You may have read about an execution in, I think it was Alabama, just within the last week or two. They tried a new method of execution. I think it was called, can't remember, I thought I wrote it down. It's nitrogen gas. It's supposed to be quick, easy. It suffocates you. But the one who was executed a couple of weeks ago, his spiritual advisor was watching and said he thrashed for something like 12 minutes, was obviously agitated, in pain. For 12 minutes he was struggling to breathe. I mean, it's a natural, your body tries to breathe even if you aren't intending to, but he was trying to. And that, he described it as torture, and he said he started crying. So, and there are a couple of other states that have announced the possibility of trying that method of execution. Now, why would one even try to change that method of execution? Lethal injection, which has been used so far for a long time, is becoming harder because many of the companies that make the gas that they use to inject to cause the lethal injection, many supplies come from Europe. European companies are manufacturing it. In small doses, it's used for as anesthesia, small doses. But in a bigger dose, it causes death, presumably instantly, But these European companies have declared that they refuse to sell to Americans unless they will be guaranteed that it will be only for life-saving purposes and not for executions. Thank you. Yes, my son is married to a French woman, and her mother said to me, "I do not understand you Americans." This was at the time of one of the executions. "I do not understand you Americans." So, at any rate, we'll see. We'll see if these other states go ahead with using it. Some of the big issues. Am I running out of time? How are we doing?
You're fine.
Okay, good. Some of the issues that move people to oppose the death penalty, one of them is government overreach. One of them is the role of the prosecutor having much sway in it. And along with that, although not necessarily the same thing, there's the issue of corruption within the system. You've heard tales of judges being bribed, maybe. I don't think that happens very often, but there is enough. It happens often enough so that you can, it pops into your head anyway, mine anyway. Another possibility is innocence. As I say, Raheem Taylor last year was executed, but I don't remember what the conditions were that made it a doubtful conviction. That people have said that today the trial, given the arguments that were used at the time, would not be considered adequate for a death sentence, to ask for death. Later on this year, possibly, a couple of guys who they're saying are imminent. One of them is Marcellus Williams, and he got the death penalty in Bob McCulloch's jurisdiction, St. Louis County, and Bob McCulloch was a firm believer in the death penalty, and he gave as many of them as he could, asked for as many as he could. But in this case, he rammed it through by squelching evidence. There were bloody footprints at the scene of the murder, not his shoe size. There was DNA evidence, but it wasn't his. Snitches, that is, people who were locked up with him in jail while he was there awaiting trial, who swore that he had told them that he had done it. Well, in both cases, they received somehow lighter treatment than they were going to receive. This is a known pattern. Somebody will promise the prosecutor, "Yeah, I'll swear that he confessed to me," when he didn't at all, in exchange for getting something lighter. And what the lighter could be, I don't know. It differs from person to person. But Marcellus Williams has been on death row, and his case has come before the Supreme Court a couple of times on various different issues, and he has won. But they're running out of issues now, except that he's innocent. And I remember one time, many years ago, a case out of Texas, and I've forgotten who it was. But his case came before the Supreme Court. Evidence had been uncovered that indicated he was innocent. And so innocent, although the Supreme Court is not part of the guilt or innocence phase, but it's only to determine if due process has been followed. And the lawyer representing him said to the judges, "Your Honor, there's evidence that he is innocent." And one of the judges said, "That doesn't matter. Due process was carried out, so that's what counts. So it doesn't matter." Another issue and that innocence is one of the big issues that gets people to oppose the death penalty. the issues of brain function. There are so many things that can happen to someone: brain damage, mental illness, substance abuse. The guy who's supposed to be executed in, I forgot, in April, he had some sort of mental condition. I don't know what it was, but he had no memory of the murder, no memory whatsoever. But he acknowledged that it must have happened. If you say I did it, I did it. And apparently there's no doubt he did do it. But he doesn't remember. Whatever the condition was, that he doesn't remember it. Maybe if he hadn't had that condition, he would have done it to start with. Wouldn't have done it to start with. One other factor in getting the death penalty is, we've all heard of racism in the death penalty. And it's true, proportionately, more defendants who are black get the death penalty than whites, proportionately. But an even bigger factor is the race of the victim. If the victim is white, especially a white woman, and if the defendant is black, it's almost a slam dunk he's going to get the death penalty. And whether the defendant is white or black, it's much more likely than if the victim were male. Of course, not that we want men victims either, but it's just statistically that is one of the many inconsistencies and arbitrariness, not even arbitrary, just capricious elements of the death penalty. There was something else I saw here that I was going to tell you, and I don't even remember what it is. Anyway, does anyone have questions? Anything about an individual, about an issue, about legislation? There are two phases if someone is charged with the death, when the prosecutor asks for the death penalty. There's a guilt and innocence phase. And all that is what it says. You decide if the person was innocent or guilty. You don't at the same time give the punishment. Then later, sometimes immediately, sometimes a lot later with a different jury, and sometimes repeated for the punishment. Given the guilt, which is already established, what punishment? And that too is where the quality of the defense attorney matters. And of course, if you're really poor, you may have a public defender who may be very good and care a lot. But if your docket is too full, you can't do the kind of preparation that someone with more resources could hire someone to do. Okay, I do want to take questions. I know there must be feelings about the death penalty. Yes?
I was just wondering, what's your opinion or on how many innocent people are executed? I mean, I know you can't really tell, but
Can't really. And even if I had access to all the facts and figures, I wouldn't be able to say, because there are some who are executed with only insisting on innocence, but there's no indication. Some people will claim innocence. Most who are guilty don't claim they're innocent. That's one of the misunderstandings about the death penalty. But most people are in prison at all. Most will acknowledge it. So I have no way of knowing. There have been numbers nationally, I can't remember what they are, but in Missouri, there have been 4 exonerations. And one of them was an elderly man who passed away not longer after he got out. Another one, there are 2 who are still in prison. Well, one who is still in prison because he was in prison already when the charge came down. He's been acquitted of the death sentence, so he's counted as one of the exonerees, but he was already in prison for something else. And then there are 2 guys who did get out, and they have tried their best to live a life as well as they can after having been in prison for, one of them for 17 years, one of them for 30-something years, innocent. When they're finally exonerated and get out, very few job skills. They're lucky if they have family left to support them. And they're struggling. They're struggling. They're managing to stay clean, to stay out of trouble, but they are struggling. Yeah.
So you said there was a bill that you're working on to eradicate the judges being.
Right.
Do you have the number of the bill?
Ooh.
Or who's
You know, I'm embarrassed to say I don't have it with me. I should have had those details with me. But if you're interested, and check our website, MADPMO, then .org, then it'll be listed there somehow. Sorry. Yeah. Sometimes people ask, why are you against the death penalty? Well, there are a lot of reasons different reasons that people oppose it. For some, it's a religious matter. Only God can kill. For some, and my religion says don't kill. For others, it's a horror at the possibility of innocence. That alone is horrible. For others, for me personally, there is some evidence, as I think I said, that the death penalty doesn't deter crime. In fact, in some cases, some researchers have found what they call a brutalizing effect. That's not overall. There are different conditions in different states, but it certainly doesn't prevent it. And it may well contribute to crime. And I keep thinking, if the state kills someone, even someone who really did something horrible, but if the state kills, if that's a legitimate way to respond to people who did something horrible, why are we surprised there's so many killings on the street? So-and-so dissed me, he got to go. So-and-so, bad drug deal, he's got to go. That's my reason. It's a practical reason that I don't want to live in the kind of society where killing is legitimate from government on down to the street. I won't talk about war. I know there have been, that's a different issue entirely. Okay. Yeah.
What's the, I heard that it's cheaper to keep somebody in prison for life than it is to...
Yes. The reason for that is the process, if the prosecutor decides to ask for death, first of all, they've had a lengthier pretrial discovery period where it takes more evidence to dig up the evidence for the aggravating factors and so on. For the trial itself, there are many more legal barriers to sloppiness that should take place. There's an enormous amount of time involved to allow both sides to dig up the evidence. Especially the defense needs, whether it's character witness, whether it's an expert about mental illness, whether expert witness isn't cheap. And there are all these big costs already before the person has even been to the guilt or innocence phase. This just all has to come out. If the prosecutor is going to ask for the death penalty, they have all this work to do ahead of time before they've even gotten a guilty verdict. Then after the guilty verdict, one Supreme Court judge once said, in discussing all of these precautions that go beyond what ordinary criminals get, he said, death is different. And it is. If you make a mistake, you can't undo that. You can't say, oops, sorry, we made a mistake. Of course, they wouldn't say that anyway. They'd find some way of covering that up. Can anyone think of any reason why you either support it or oppose it that I haven't mentioned? Yes.
I would oppose it because, like you said, like the judges and everything, if they're guilty without a reasonable doubt, there's inmates name you talk to, and I've talked to them personally because
Oh, really?
I worked in a prison for 8 years. I worked at the
Oh.
He's guilty. If they're guilty of shadow of doubt and there's jury of their peers, yeah, if it's a pedophile, 100%. But if there's any doubt, no death penalty.
Yeah, for pedophiles, that's a difficult one.
I would like to know the names of some of the guys they're talking about, because I know a lot of them.
Which guys? The ones that I mentioned whose dates are coming up or who were?
And in the past as well.
In the past, let's see, last year I think I may have mentioned Amber McLaughlin, Leonard Raheem Taylor, Michael Tisis, Johnny Johnson. And at the time when one happens, I know very well who it is, but I can't remember before. I just can't remember them all. And, beyond a reasonable doubt, yeah, that's always...
Because, yes, there's corruption everywhere in the government. But there's also good people in the government, too.
Yes, yes.
Maybe there should be some oversight if it does come down. If that judgment comes down, definitely, maybe there should be a review of oversight before from an external party.
There is supposed to be a process. This doesn't quite get at the issue of corruption and wrongness, but a process by which, in order to examine the request for death or not, judges are supposed to present how this fits in the past. If this is cruel and unusual, which is the statutory definition, cruel and unusual is the punishment, is the principle that the Supreme Court, the judges that lawyers use to evaluate cruel and unusual. If you can show that in the past, execution for this particular crime, whatever it is never used, then it's not, it's very unusual. It doesn't fall in the cruel and unusual. But I've been told by a defense lawyer, well, some years ago, I don't know if it's still true, that the judges don't really have time to examine all of the sentences to see if, in fact, this is usual or unusual. Cruel and unusual punishment, that should not be. If it's unusual.
That wording is abstract anyway.
I'm sorry, what?
So that wording is kind of abstract anyway.
It is abstract, and it's supposed to be a help, and in principle it is. If it's unusual, then why would you give this person the death penalty when all of these people before him have never gotten the death penalty? That seems unbalanced. It's supposed to be a protection. But yeah, there are a lot of things that are supposed to be protections that are sometimes for good reasons just hard to follow through with. Everybody's supposed to have good defense. Well, then there's the story I remember reading about some years ago, and I can't tell you who it was. I think it was in Texas. It was a state where instead of a public defender system like ours is, and ours is pretty good, short of the fact that they don't have enough resources, but it was an attorney who was hired to defend the guy, and during the trial, he fell asleep. He snored during the trial, the defense attorney. And afterwards, he was criticized for that, and he said, well, the Supreme Court has said that everyone is entitled to a lawyer, but they didn't say he had to be awake. Yeah. Obviously, I'm very much in this. It sounds as if I don't have sympathy for the victims. That is not true. But in opposing the death penalty and executions, our efforts go towards stopping the execution, stopping the death penalty. And the victims sometimes get ignored. I read a book several years ago about someone whose brother, I think, had been killed, who said that she wished he hadn't, the murderer had not gotten the death penalty because there are so many. She wanted him punished because he had killed her brother. But there are so many appeals and court appearances and having to come back and give your evidence again and again and again. Far more, that's part of the expense, the cost, by the way. There are far more times when you have to go through it. She said, we wouldn't have had to go through it so much if he hadn't gotten the death penalty to start with. Even though, in principle, she would have supported it. I think she wanted him killed. But she didn't want to go through all of those. She wished she hadn't had to go through all of those repeated appearances. Every time there is a penalty hearing, the witnesses come forward. It just goes on and on and on until the execution or until exoneration. Yeah.
That's it.
Oh, that's
my time.
Yeah.
Okay. So